Huawei just dropped a 5-nanometer chip inside a sleek new laptop, and the internet exploded. Headlines screamed that China had finally cracked 5 nanometers, that Beijing had broken US sanctions, and that SMIC had pulled off the impossible. But less than a minute into a teardown by Tech Insights, the story flipped upside down. That supposed Chinese breakthrough? The silicon was clearly stamped Made in Taiwan. And the date code? Week 35 of 2020. So what's really going on here? The truth is both simpler and more strategic. Huawei is still living off stockpiles of pre-sanctioned chips made by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. And this revelation tells us far more about the future of the US-China chip war than any flashy headline ever could. Let's rewind. On May 16, 2019, the US government added Huawei to the entity list. Overnight, Huawei lost access to Google services, advanced chip design software, ARM licenses, and, most importantly, cutting-edge chips from global foundries. By September 15, 2020, TSMC officially cut off shipments to Huawei, complying with US rules banning the sale of semiconductors made with American technology. That was supposed to be the end of Huawei's high-performance chip ambitions. And for a while, it looked like Washington had succeeded. Huawei's global smartphone sales collapsed. Analysts called it checkmate. But in August 2023, Huawei shocked the world by releasing the Mate 60 Pro, powered by a 7-nanometer Kirin 9000S chip made by SMIC in Shanghai. Suddenly, Beijing had a symbol of defiance, proof that Chinese engineers could still push forward despite sanctions. The revelation spurred celebration inside China and panic in Washington. If SMIC could do 7 nanometers, what was stopping them from doing 5? That brings us to the laptop at the center of today's story. On January 4, 2024, Bloomberg published an exclusive based on a teardown of Huawei's Qingyun L540 business notebook. Conducted by Tech Insights in Ottawa, the lab confirmed that the device ran on a Kirin 9006C processor. At first glance, it looked like a 5-nanometer breakthrough from SMIC, but closer inspection told a different story. The floor plan was nearly identical to the older Kirin 9000 series. The electro-optical checks matched TSMC's N5 process, not SMIC's stretched 7-nanometer variant. And most importantly, the date code was 2020, long before Huawei was cut off. Translation? Huawei isn't magically printing 5-nanometer chips in China. They're carefully rationing a stockpile of TSMC-made wafers produced before September 2020. This was a strategic move. Huawei spent at least 18 months before the cutoff hoarding as many advanced wafers as possible. Analysts estimate they secured hundreds of thousands of units across multiple product lines. Think of semiconductors like bottled wine. Once made, they don't spoil. They just sit in trays, waiting to be packaged. Huawei understood this. By hoarding chips in 2019 and 2020, it bought itself years of breathing room. Each Mate 40, each Mate 60 Pro, each Qingyun laptop that ships today is drawing from that secret inventory. But here's the catch. The stockpile is finite. Every device is one step closer to empty shelves. That's why the Qingyun L540 is not a triumph of new Chinese 5-nanometer capability. It's a countdown clock. When those trays of 2020 wafers finally run out, Huawei will face a hard choice. Rely fully on SMIC's less advanced 7-nanometer chips, or fall back on foreign processors, which would be politically toxic in Beijing. Let's pause to give SMIC credit. Their 7-nanometer Kirin 9000S inside the Mate 60 Pro is a genuine achievement. They managed it with deep ultraviolet immersion scanners and aggressive multi-patterning, pushing 2000's 10's-era tools to their limits. But the leap from 7 nanometers to 5 nanometers is another world entirely. It requires extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, which only the Dutch company ASML makes. And thanks to US pressure, no EUV system has been shipped to China. Could SMIC brute force its way with quadruple DUV patterning? Maybe, in theory. But in practice, yields would collapse below 50%, and costs would skyrocket to uneconomical levels. That's why most experts agree China won't have real 5-nanometer production until it finds an alternative to EUV. or until geopolitics change. The Bloomberg revelation sent shockwaves. SMIC shares slid in Hong Kong as investors realized the 5-nanometer breakthrough wasn't theirs. U.S. policymakers quietly celebrated, relieved that sanctions were still holding at the bleeding edge. Huawei stayed silent. Legally, they couldn't admit to using stockpiled chips. Meanwhile, rivals like Apple and Qualcomm are already moving toward 3-nanometer mass production with TSMC and Samsung. The performance gap keeps widening, but Huawei still found a way to win. Inside China, the Mate 60 Pro outsold iPhones in late 2023, helping Huawei return to nearly $100 billion in revenue. Now, some ask, did TSMC break the rules? The answer is no. The Kirin 9006C wafers were legally manufactured before September 2020, when TSMC still supplied Huawei. Once those wafers were diced and stored, they became legitimate inventory. From there, Huawei's procurement arm, HiSilicon, likely reacquired them through intermediaries. This is the gray zone of sanctions. Chips don't vanish. They just change warehouse addresses. The US saw the same problem with Russia after Ukraine sanctions. High-tech components still found their way in through third countries. The lesson is simple. Sanctions slow down supply, but they rarely eliminate it completely. So where does Huawei go from here? In the short term, it will stretch the 2020 stockpile as long as possible. Expect more new devices secretly powered by vintage TSMC silicon. In the medium term, SMIC will keep pushing its 7-nanometer process, maybe even achieving a 6-nanometer refresh by 2025. And in the long term, Huawei is betting on chiplet packaging, 3D stacking, and software-hardware co-design to extract maximum performance from older nodes. They can't win by chasing the smallest node size anymore. Instead, they'll compete through integration, selling complete ecosystems of chips, software, and cloud services. So let's be crystal clear. The Huawei Qingyun L540 isn't proof that China cracked 5 nanometers. It's a time capsule, a chip built by TSMC in 2020, preserved for years, and deployed in 2024 to keep Huawei's lineup alive. Yes, SMIC's 7-nanometer progress is real, but 5 nanometers? Not yet. The sanctions are still biting, and the real story isn't in press releases. It's in warehouses full of old wafers, slowly running out. The next big question is, when the last 5-nanometer stockpile runs dry, will Huawei's next teardown finally reveal a homegrown Chinese 5-nanometer chip? Or will the West sanctions keep China locked one step behind? One thing's for sure, the chip war is only heating up.